In this video, you'll meet Rachel Mamiya Hernandez, who has applied principles of project-based learning in a Portuguese language class. Rachel is one of a small number of pioneers applying the principles of PBL as defined by the Buck Institute for Education and contextualized in language learning and instruction by the National Foreign Language Resource Center. In the last couple of years, the NFLRC has done intensive work on project-based language learning involving experienced educators and leaders. The goal is to provide language educators with the tools and knowledge they need to design and implement quality project-based language learning experiences. As you watch, please be on the lookout for these key characteristics of Rachel's project design. Number one, her project has impact in the real world. Rachel goes beyond the walls of the classroom, connects with the community speaking the language that she is teaching, and makes the world a better place. Second, student voice and choice. Rachel allowed her students room to shape the project as it progressed, asserting their own voice and choice in determining what the final product would be. Third, Rachel was adaptable in implementing her original plan. When things did not go as expected, she revised her project design to accommodate the real situation on the ground. And finally, Rachel's approach reflects design thinking. She looks back on the implementation of her project, and for each part that did not work as envisioned, she develops ideas for how to do things differently next time. Please enjoy the video, and if you wish to know more about project-based language learning, check out nflrc.hawaii.edu for updates on events and resources. We hope you'll consider becoming part of this active community of educators.
So my project is called Vamos Ler, which means let's read in Portuguese. And basically the idea was a project to help sort of increase engagement and motivate students to build literacy in Brazil, especially in low-income communities where it's kind of an issue. There was a UN report, I can't remember the exact date, but it still cites illiteracy and functional illiteracy as a problem that needs to be addressed in northeastern Brazil. So the idea is starting young and encouraging literacy and also bringing books to children in an area where it's actually very expensive. Books are relatively expensive in printed material in Brazil, so trying to give more access to books for these children. And also, of course, incorporating the part of having my students practice their Portuguese and reach out to a wider audience and do something meaningful. The idea for this project sort of surged from a few different factors. So one factor was my participation in the Project-Based Language Learning Summer Institute because I had actually had a totally different project in mind, and it was very elaborate and complicated, but maybe not as meaningful. And seeing some of the projects that other people had done or were thinking about, and especially the one that comes to mind is the one that Don, I don't want to pronounce his last name wrong, but I think it's Dewella, did with children, I believe in Haiti, in his class writing books for them. So that sort of gave me that kind of idea. And another idea, which I had had previously, right before the Summer Institute, I had taken a group of students to study abroad in Brazil. And we visited several social projects there in the city of Salvador. And I think I was really moved, and the students were really moved, just by the conditions that the students are in, and also that sort of the difference that these projects make in their lives. So I had that idea. I wanted to do something more meaningful with my students, and then sort of picked up the inspiration from what Don was doing with his students. So I had the idea overall for the project, but it was kind of, figuring out how things were going to go. So the very first thing we did, and because I had the original class I was going to do this with was canceled last minute for low enrollment. It was actually a higher level class. I ended up sort of adopting the project and adapting it to an intermediate level class. And originally, they're already in this Teletandem project, a totally separate project where they Skype with university students from Brazil. So the first sort of foray into the idea of books and children's books was sort of a question and answer with their partners in Brazil about what kind of books children like in Brazil, what stories they remember, you know, from their childhood and that sort of thing. So just to sort of take a temperature and get an idea of what's popular for children in Brazil. One idea that I had for working on the book is because these are largely Afro-Brazilian communities, would be sort of tying in Afro-Brazilian identity and empowerment. And while that was sort of my original idea, it didn't exactly end up that way in the books that they wrote. So we did look and review a series of children's books. So not a ton, but I think we looked at 10 or 12 children's books, and they had a rubric and they evaluated them, whether they were a good example, bad example. And then we kind of got an idea and made a criteria of what makes a good children's book. So then after we came up with that, we started thinking about our own children's books. And while they didn't really seem to tie in the identity piece, because we had also watched a video about a young boy who was actually from São Paulo, but a similar socioeconomic situation to the children that are in the project that we're working with. But they didn't really seem to tie that in. And I didn't want to force them, you know, in any direction. I wanted to give them sort of their own liberty with the books. And that's actually another piece. They became very invested in their own books. My original idea was we would all write books and then we would vote on our favorite book and all work on one or two books as a class. But people sort of got so into writing their books that I felt bad if I were to take away anyone's book, or, you know, I thought it might be unfair because I do have some heritage learners. So of course, you know, their language is going to be a little bit more accelerated, or they're going to be able to write at a higher level than some of the non-heritage learners. So I decided to sort of scrap that and just continue letting everybody work on their own book. And then, you know, kids like variety. Something might speak to someone more than something else. The reason we used the video was kind of to point out there's a lack of that, and also to look at what their partners had said, that there's kind of, you know, a missing sort of space there. There's not that many Afro-Brazilian, you know, characters in fairy tales or in folk stories or in, you know, children's literature in general. But that sort of piece just seemed to They seemed to recognize that, but they didn't seem to take that as inspiration for their literature. Mm-hmm. And then later, when we were actually in contact with the teacher who works with those students, she was saying that their two favorite books that the children in that group really liked were one called Menina Bonita do Laço de Fita, which is about a young Afro-Brazilian girl and sort of has this idea of it doesn't matter what color you are, you know, we're all the same. And then another one was O Cabelo de Lele, which is another sort of idea of embracing Afro-Brazilian beauty and your hairstyle and texture. And even though those were the books cited as the children's favorite, and we didn't read them, but they're online with videos. So we kind of watched them, and they actually evaluated those books as well. But it didn't really seem to influence the final product for most of the students. Yeah, I think if I were to tweak something to give me a result closer to what I was expecting, is try to get a little bit more communication between my students and the teacher. Most of the communication was between myself and the teacher for time difference and just availability. It worked out that way. Also, there was not enough infrastructure in the school itself for the children to be able to communicate. And there's issues, you know, with parents and releasing permission and that kind of thing. So yeah, maybe a little bit more communication. The other thing was we used the tool Storybird, and it's beautiful. It has amazing illustrations, but sometimes, you know, you're confined to what you pick. So you can't sort of mix and match pages from different artists. You're kind of stuck with the pages that you have. So it just seemed maybe the themes that inspired them or the pictures that inspired them were not necessarily related to Afro-Brazilian identity, or maybe some of them just didn't feel comfortable being outsiders writing about that. It's not something I really asked them about because it seemed to be an idea I had to weave into their books, but they seemed to not do it, so I didn't really push it. What worked particularly well, I think the students got really excited about it and motivated. I think they sort of bought into it and became invested into it. So I think so far that's the part that it seems to be meaningful to them. As a language instructor, I mean, I think, and I've mentioned this before, I think just doing something meaningful and reaching out to a wider audience, you know, it's become so easy now with technology and with communication that, doing something like this 20 or 30 years ago would have required a lot more effort, a lot more planning, a lot more logistics, where now I think it is a lot easier to do. I also think that, with the advances of technology, and information is everywhere, right? So it's no longer what's in the book that's important. I think it's what you do and the experiences that are important. So I think, just making learning a meaningful and memorable experience. One thing that I did notice, and that was different than I would have thought. Originally, I thought we're going to work on certain things like descriptions and, narration in the past, where I realized, and this was actually good for the class that I have, because as I said, I have mixed heritage learners and non-heritage learners, and I have different levels of proficiency. So I think one thing that's good is I was able to individually work with the students and give them feedback on the things they needed help with, whereas it was not like a one-size-fits-all sort of grammar instruction. So maybe, well, on my students, I think hopefully it's been an interesting and useful learning experience, and I think it's been something that, I keep using this word, but something that's meaningful for them. For the students in Brazil, hopefully, I think it will be exciting for them. Like I told my students, books are very expensive, relatively speaking, in Brazil. A lot of children don't even have a book to take home and, look at and be their own. So I think hopefully it'll make them feel, special. And I think also that's one reason we have the videos for them to introduce themselves, so they actually feel like, wow, someone on the other side of the world is doing this for me or for us, so hopefully I think there'll be a positive reaction. In the future, I think I'd like to have it a little bit more structured and try to do it in a shorter timeline, and have a little more communication beforehand with the partner. I sort of, by luck and by chance, from a visiting professor who was here, Savio Siqueira, he gave me a contact of a former student of his, Kelly, who worked with the project. So that's kind of just how it happened. So yeah, that was luck. I've considered also doing something with Portuguese students in immersion schools in the United States, just to facilitate communication and to facilitate timelines. So that's something I've thought about. But yeah, I've also have a friend in Brazil who read about my project because I posted something online, and she's works a lot in the Amazon, and she says, oh, let's do something with the students I work with. So yeah, there's the possibility of expanding it to other places too. But yeah, just trying to get things, I think, a little bit more streamlined and organized. And now that I've been through it, I think I can think about the different expectations and the different issues I might run into. Of course, there's always a lot of unknowns, I think, when you're doing projects, but that's life. In terms of benefits, I think, again, students get a meaningful learning experience. They get to actually use their language for an audience, in a real world context. I think, I prefer doing things like this to doing exercises out of a textbook. I think it just makes it more real world, and it makes it more meaningful for people.